The live stream had 847 viewers when Connor Blake forced 16-year-old Austrian exchange student Vienna Walsh to her knees in Roosevelt High's equipment room, demanding she crawl like the foreign dog she is, while his girlfriend recorded for their immigrant humiliation challenge. What Connor didn't know was that Vienna's helpless exchange student act was about to crumble in exactly 23 seconds, revealing a background that would send 3 students to juvenile detention and trigger the largest Title IX investigation in Colorado history. Roosevelt High had been building toward this moment for weeks, where toxic masculinity, social media cruelty, and institutional blindness would collide with someone who'd learned to fight back before she'd learned to speak English. If you've ever felt powerless watching injustice unfold, or wondered how far institutional protection can stretch before it snaps, Vienna's story will show you exactly what happens when silence stops being survival and becomes resistance. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. And sometimes the best revenge is being completely prepared for war, while your enemies still think they're playing games. Vienna Walsh appeared to be everything Roosevelt High's elite expected from exchange students: polite, grateful, invisible. At 16, she spoke with a gentle Austrian accent that masked fluent English, dressed in thrift store clothes that concealed an athletic build, and carried herself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to being underestimated. Her host family, the Richardsons, had welcomed her with the kind of performative kindness that looked good on college applications, never bothering to ask about her background beyond the basic exchange program paperwork. What they didn't know was that Vienna's cultural adaptation classes in Vienna had included Krav Maga training for young women traveling abroad. What her classmates couldn't see beneath her oversized sweaters were calluses from years of competitive rock climbing. And what nobody suspected was that her father wasn't just in business, but Austria's Deputy Minister of Education, monitoring international student safety programs. The mysterious phone calls Vienna took during lunch breaks, always stepping away to speak in rapid German, weren't homesick conversations with friends. They were briefings. Connor Blake was Roosevelt High royalty by birthright and brutality. As captain of both the wrestling team and student council, the 17-year-old had inherited his father's position as unofficial king of a school where Judge Blake's donations had literally built the new gymnasium. Connor's girlfriend, Skylar Chen, provided the social media influence with her 15,000 Instagram followers, while his best friend, Marcus Rivera, served as muscle for their systematic campaigns against anyone who threatened their hierarchy. They'd perfected a 3-stage process: social isolation, public humiliation, and forced submission. Previous targets had either transferred schools or broken under the pressure. But the immigrant humiliation challenge was their latest innovation, designed to go viral while maintaining plausible deniability as harmless pranks. Roosevelt High School served affluent Westwood, Colorado, where $2 million homes surrounded a campus that functioned more like a private club than public education. Principal Janet Morrison ran the school like a corporation, where problems were managed through reputation control rather than actual resolution. The exchange program existed solely for college application resumes and tax benefits, with foreign students expected to be grateful, compliant, and temporary. When Vienna had politely corrected misinformation about European history in advanced placement classes, she'd unknowingly marked herself as problematic by administrators who preferred their international students to remain academically invisible. The harassment began with surgical precision during Vienna's second week. Connor had noticed her perfect English pronunciation during presentations, the way teachers nodded approvingly at her insights, and how several students had begun sitting near her at lunch. Excellence made her dangerous to his carefully maintained ecosystem, and excellence from a foreign charity case was intolerable. The first attack was digital, launched with the kind of coordinated malice that only teenage cruelty could achieve. Schuyler had created a fake Instagram account called @AustrianPrincessProblems, posting edited photos of Vienna with captions mocking her accent and clothes. Within hours, #exchange student. Reality was trending among Roosevelt students, with increasingly cruel memes about Vienna's background. The posts suggested she was spoiled, entitled, and looking down on American culture, each image carefully crafted to make her appear arrogant and condescending. The campaign was sophisticated, using real photos from Vienna's social media, but edited with fake quotes and situations that painted her as everything Connor needed her to be: a perfect target. Vienna's response surprised everyone. Instead of deleting her social media or complaining to teachers, she'd quietly screenshotted everything while continuing to post photos of Colorado landscapes with thoughtful captions about cultural differences. Her grace under fire only made Connor angrier, because victims were supposed to break, not document. What he didn't realize was that Vienna's unusual calmness under pressure came from training, and her mysterious recording behavior was building something much larger than a complaint to the principal's office. Connor decided Vienna needed a more direct lesson. During chemistry class, he accidentally knocked her experiment off the table, destroying weeks of work while Mr. Patterson conveniently stepped out to take a phone call. Glass shattered across the floor in a cascade of ruined research, while Connor's teammates snickered at their perfectly timed distraction. When Vienna simply cleaned up the mess without complaint, gathering broken beakers and soggy lab notes with the same methodical precision she approached everything, Connor realized traditional intimidation wouldn't work on someone this controlled. The gym incident was calculated humiliation designed to exploit every possible vulnerability. During mandatory fitness testing, Connor had arranged for Vienna's locker to be mistakenly assigned next to the boys' section. When she'd quietly requested a different location, Schuyler had live-streamed her unreasonable demands, portraying Vienna as entitled and difficult. The video showed Vienna politely explaining the situation to Coach Martinez, who had been instructed by Principal Morrison to avoid accommodating special requests from exchange students. But Vienna's response had been devastating in its simplicity. She'd completed her fitness tests in the disputed locker area, changing with such efficient professionalism that Connor's harassment looked juvenile by comparison. Her pull-up performance, 18 consecutive reps executed with perfect form, had left the watching students impressed rather than mocking. The unexpected physical capabilities should have been a warning, but Connor's arrogance prevented him from recognizing that his target might be more prepared than she appeared. The equipment room confrontation was Connor's masterstroke, planned with the kind of calculated cruelty that had made him Roosevelt High's most feared student. He'd cornered Vienna after school on a Friday, claiming she'd stolen Schuyler's boyfriend's attention during a group project. The accusation was false, but it provided justification for what he'd already planned to do. Marcus had positioned himself by the door while Schuyler prepared her phone camera, adjusting lighting and angles for maximum humiliation value. "You're going to crawl across this room and apologize," Connor had demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been truly challenged. "Then you're going to post a video explaining why foreign students should be grateful for American hospitality." The live stream title read, "Teaching Respect to Exchange Students," already attracting viewers who expected entertainment at Vienna's expense. Connor's plan was perfect, combining physical dominance, social media amplification, and a psychological destruction in one devastating package. Vienna had looked directly into Schuyler's camera, her accent suddenly crisp and authoritative, rather than the soft uncertainty she'd maintained for weeks. "I need everyone watching this to remember what you're about to see," she'd said with a calmness that made Marcus shift uncomfortably by the door. "Because in about 30 seconds, everything you think you know about power at this school is going to change." The sudden accent shift, from hesitant foreigner to confident authority, should have warned them that something fundamental was different about their usual victim. Connor had grabbed Vienna's wrist, trying to force her to the ground, while Schuyler adjusted her camera angle for the best humiliation shot. The live stream viewers were commenting rapidly, some encouraging the abuse while others expressed growing discomfort at what they were witnessing. But instead of the compliance Connor expected, he'd felt something unexpected, controlled resistance that suggested hidden strength. Vienna's calm expression hadn't changed, but her body language had shifted subtly into something that made Marcus step unconsciously backward. "I've tried to handle this diplomatically," Vienna had said, her voice carrying an authority that made the equipment room suddenly feel smaller. The word choice, diplomatically, was strange for a high school student, suggesting experience with formal conflict resolution that didn't match her exchange student background. "But since you've chosen to assault a foreign national on camera while broadcasting it internationally, diplomatic solutions are no longer available." The threat in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, carrying implications that went far beyond typical teenage confrontation. Connor's grip on her wrist had tightened, but Vienna's response was immediate and devastating. The first move was so fast that Schuyler's camera barely caught it, a textbook Krav Maga wrist escape that simultaneously struck Connor's solar plexus with precision that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air. The technique was military-grade training, not something learned in high school self-defense classes. Marcus had rushed forward, but Vienna had been ready for him too. She'd pivoted low, using his momentum to execute a perfect hip toss that sent 190 pounds of wrestler crashing into equipment shelves. The sound of metal and muscle colliding echoed through the livestream as athletic equipment cascaded around Marcus's motionless form, creating a debris field of basketball pumps, wrestling mats, and scattered sports gear. Schuyler had screamed but kept recording, her social media instincts overriding self-preservation. What she was capturing would be analyzed by law enforcement, international education officials, and martial arts experts worldwide within hours. The video quality was perfect, showing Vienna's movements with the kind of clinical precision that suggested extensive training. Every strike had been controlled, designed to neutralize rather than permanently damage, which spoke to professional instruction rather than lucky desperation. Vienna had turned to Schuyler's camera with the same calm expression she'd worn throughout weeks of harassment. But now her voice carried the unmistakable cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "For those watching," she'd said in perfect, unaccented English, "what you've just witnessed is the legal and proportionate response to assault by a foreign national with diplomatic immunity. These students have committed crimes against a person under international protection." The words diplomatic immunity hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Connor had tried to stand, but Vienna's foot on his shoulder had kept him grounded, not violently, but with the kind of controlled force that suggested extensive training in restraint techniques. "You wanted me to crawl." She'd continued conversationally, watching Schuyler's live stream viewer count climb past 1,000 as word spread through Roosevelt High's social networks. "But the only people crawling today are the ones who thought cruelty was a game." The equipment room door had begun to rattle, as if Vienna's earlier statements had been a signal rather than a threat. Through the small window, Connor could see shapes moving in the hallway, but the figures were too tall and too formally dressed to be students or teachers. Vienna's timing had been perfect, suggesting coordination that went far beyond coincidence. Her weeks of apparent helplessness were beginning to look like something much more sophisticated intelligence gathering. "Miss Walsh," a voice called through the door, carrying an authority that made Connor's blood run cold. "Are you injured, Keys?" The deference was unmistakable, treating Vienna with the kind of protective concern usually reserved for diplomats or celebrities' children. Schuyler's live stream chat was exploding, with viewers recognizing something significant was happening, though most couldn't yet understand what they were witnessing. Vienna had smiled then, not with triumph, but with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was finally paying off. "I'm perfectly safe," she'd called back, her voice now carrying traces of an accent that sounded more educated than Austrian. "Though I believe these students may need medical attention after their educational experience." The sound of keys in the lock was accompanied by radio chatter that Connor recognized from his father's courthouse, the kind of official communication that meant serious law enforcement was involved. Vienna's mysterious phone calls during lunch breaks suddenly made sense, as did her unusual composure under pressure and her strategic approach to documenting harassment. As the door swung open, Connor Blake realized that his carefully planned humiliation had become something entirely different. The girl he'd tried to force to crawl was standing over him with the kind of calm authority that suggested she'd been prepared for this moment all along. And the federal badges entering the room meant that his harassment campaign had just become an international incident. The live stream was still running, broadcasting Connor's terror to viewers who were beginning to understand that they'd witnessed something much more significant than a high school fight. Vienna Walsh wasn't just an exchange student who'd learned to defend herself. She was someone whose true background was about to transform everything anyone thought they knew about power at Roosevelt High. The equipment room door had burst open as if Vienna's earlier statements had been a signal rather than a threat. Principal Morrison entered with two men in federal badges, their timing too perfect to be coincidental. The first agent, tall with graying temples and the bearing of someone accustomed to serious situations, surveyed the scene with professional detachment. Connor's expression shifted from confusion to horror as he realized that Vienna's weeks of helpless victim behavior had been an elaborate intelligence-gathering operation. "Miss Walsh," Agent Martinez said respectfully, his deference unmistakable as he treated Vienna with the kind of protective authority usually reserved for diplomats or celebrities' children. "Are you injured?" The question carried weight beyond typical concern, suggesting protocols and procedures that went far beyond high school incident management. Vienna's response was immediate and practiced, the kind of formal interaction that spoke to extensive experience with official situations. "I'm unharmed, Agent Martinez," Vienna replied, her accent now carrying traces of sophistication that hadn't been present during her weeks of apparent vulnerability. Though these students may require medical evaluation following their educational experience regarding international law and diplomatic immunity. The clinical precision of her language, combined with her obvious familiarity with the federal agent, painted a picture that made Connor's harassment campaign look like children playing with forces they couldn't comprehend. Schuyler's live stream chat had exploded with viewers recognizing the federal badges and Vienna's sudden transformation from victim to protected person. The narrative they'd been watching had reversed so completely that comments were questioning whether the entire harassment campaign had been recorded as evidence for a larger investigation. The viewer count had climbed past 2,000 as word spread across social media that something unprecedented was happening at Roosevelt High. Agent Martinez turned his attention to Connor, who remained on the floor with Vienna's foot maintaining gentle but firm pressure on his shoulder. "Mr. Blake," the agent said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made Connor's father's judicial position seem suddenly irrelevant. "You're under arrest for assault against a foreign national under diplomatic protection, civil rights violations, and international harassment documented across multiple platforms." The Miranda rights that followed were delivered with the precision of someone who'd handled diplomatic incidents before. Marcus had regained consciousness but remained motionless among the scattered equipment, his wrestler's instincts telling him that any movement might be interpreted as continued aggression. The federal backup that entered behind Agent Martinez included a female agent who immediately began documenting the scene with professional photography equipment, capturing evidence that would be analyzed by international education officials and legal experts. Vienna stepped back from Connor with fluid grace, allowing the agents to secure him while maintaining the same calm demeanor she'd shown throughout the confrontation. But now her composure suggested professional training rather than natural resilience, and her obvious familiarity with federal procedures confirmed suspicions about her true background that had been building throughout her weeks at Roosevelt High. "Miss Chen," Agent Martinez addressed Schuyler, whose live stream was still broadcasting to an audience that had grown to include viewers from across the country. "Your live stream has documented multiple federal crimes, and we'll need your device as evidence. You're also under arrest as an accessory to assault and civil rights violations." The social media fame Schuyler had sought through Vienna's humiliation had transformed into evidence in what agents described as an international incident requiring State Department intervention. Principal Morrison's face had gone pale as the implications hit her. The federal investigation she was witnessing meant that Roosevelt High's reputation, her career, and the district's funding were all suddenly at risk. "Agent Martinez," she said carefully, "I wasn't aware that Miss Walsh had any special status. The exchange program paperwork indicated standard international student protocols." Her attempt to distance herself from institutional failure was immediate, but documentation of administrative indifference would prove difficult to explain away. "Principal Morrison," Vienna interjected, her voice now carrying the kind of educated authority that made her previous submissive behavior look like skilled performance art. "I provided your office with complete diplomatic documentation during my enrollment process, including emergency contact protocols and federal notification requirements. Your staff chose to file those documents without review, which we've documented as part of our assessment of American educational institution compliance with international protection standards." The revelation that Vienna's harassment had been documented as part of a formal assessment sent shockwaves through the room. Agent Martinez confirmed what Connor was beginning to understand. His harassment campaign hadn't just targeted a random exchange student, but the daughter of Austria's Deputy Minister of Education, conducting an official evaluation of American student safety protocols. The systematic harassment Connor had orchestrated had become evidence of institutional failure at the highest levels. Within 30 minutes, Roosevelt High had been sealed as a federal crime scene. The equipment room where Connor had intended to humiliate Vienna had become the center of an investigation involving the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the State Department's Education Protocol Office, and Austrian diplomatic officials who were already en route from Denver. The local news vans arriving in the parking lot were joined by national media outlets as word spread that a high school bullying incident had escalated into an international diplomatic crisis. Vienna's transformation from victim to protected diplomatic family member had been captured in real time by Schuyler's live stream, creating viral content that would be analyzed by educators, law enforcement, and international relations experts worldwide. The video showed not just Vienna's physical skills, but her strategic thinking and professional composure under pressure. Every aspect of her response demonstrated training that went far beyond typical exchange student preparation. Connor Blake's arrest became a social media phenomenon within hours. The same live stream that was supposed to showcase Vienna's humiliation had been shared across international news platforms, with diplomatic officials from 3 countries demanding explanations for the systematic harassment of a protected person. Judge Blake discovered that his son's victim wasn't just a student, but the daughter of Austria's deputy education minister, whose assessment of American educational institutions could affect international treaties and federal funding for exchange programs. The judge's political connections, which had protected Connor throughout his high school career, suddenly became liabilities rather than assets. Federal civil rights charges couldn't be dismissed through local influence, and the international attention meant that any appearance of judicial favoritism would trigger diplomatic protests. Connor's future, which had been secured through privilege and athletic ability, disappeared in the span of a single live stream. Roosevelt High's student body split along lines of shock and admiration as news of Vienna's true identity spread through social media and text messages. Many students admitted they'd suspected Vienna was different, but had assumed it meant wealth or academic pressure. The revelation that she'd been documenting systematic bullying while maintaining perfect diplomatic composure had transformed her from victim to folk hero among students who'd witnessed Connor's reign of terror. Social media analysis showed that Vienna's response videos, posted after the incident, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of American civil rights law and international education protocols. She hadn't just defended herself, she'd prepared a comprehensive case against institutional failure that would be used to reform exchange programs nationwide. Her weeks of apparent helplessness had masked an intelligence-gathering operation of impressive scope and precision. Students who'd participated in the harassment campaign faced immediate consequences as federal investigators reviewed social media posts, text messages, and digital communications. Universities were contacted about pending applications, scholarships were revoked, and criminal charges were filed against students whose harassment rose to the level of civil rights violations. The immigrant humiliation challenge that was supposed to make Vienna suffer had instead created a federal case study in systematic discrimination. But Vienna's most surprising action was advocating for rehabilitation rather than maximum punishment for students who'd participated in her harassment. Her intervention saved several students from permanent consequences while ensuring that systematic changes were implemented to prevent future harassment. The balance between justice and mercy demonstrated diplomatic training that had always been hidden beneath her exchange student facade. Her recommendation that educational intervention replace purely punitive measures reflected Austrian approaches to restorative justice, creating opportunities for genuine understanding rather than simple punishment. Students who'd posted cruel memes found themselves enrolled in mandatory cultural sensitivity programs, while those who'd remained silent during harassment faced requirements to participate in peer advocacy training. Roosevelt High had been placed under federal monitoring within 24 hours of Vienna's incident, with new protocols requiring immediate reporting of any incidents involving international students. The school's culture shifted from protecting popular students to protecting vulnerable ones, with Vienna's diplomatic background serving as a reminder that assumptions about power and protection could be dangerously wronged. Or Elizabeth Rodriguez, brought in as interim principal from the Denver School District, implemented immediate reforms that transformed Roosevelt High's approach to international education. Her first action was establishing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and harassment. Backed by federal oversight that gave her authority Principal Morrison had never possessed. Every student deserves to feel safe and welcomed at Roosevelt High. Dr. Rodriguez announced during an emergency assembly, "We will not tolerate behavior that targets anyone based on their national origin, race, religion, or any other characteristic." The Vienna Protocol, as education officials named it, required background verification for exchange students and immediate escalation procedures for harassment reports. Schools across Colorado were implementing training programs based on lessons learned from Roosevelt High's failures, while universities nationwide began reviewing their own international student protection protocols. Vienna's case had triggered recognition that harassment cases could involve diplomatic complications beyond traditional civil rights concerns. Federal education funding for Roosevelt High was suspended pending completion of the investigation, creating immediate financial pressure that forced the school board to confront institutional problems they'd previously ignored. The systematic discrimination that had enabled Connor's harassment campaign was revealed to extend far beyond individual incidents, involving coaching staff who'd encouraged discriminatory behavior and administrators who'd actively discouraged complaint filing. Coach Davidson's text messages, discovered during the federal investigation, revealed explicit support for harassing foreign liberals and making them understand American values. The football program was suspended indefinitely as investigators uncovered evidence that discriminatory harassment had been institutionalized as team-building behavior. Athletic scholarships for graduating seniors were revoked as universities distanced themselves from a program associated with federal civil rights violations. Vienna's case had also triggered international review of American exchange programs, with several countries demanding better protection protocols for their young citizens studying abroad. The Austrian government had issued formal diplomatic protests, while the European Union's education ministers released a joint statement expressing concern about systematic discrimination in American educational institutions. The harassment documented at Roosevelt High School raises serious questions about institutional protections for international students. French Education Minister Dubois announced during a press conference in Paris. Most significantly, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization announced they would be conducting their own investigation into educational discrimination against international students in American schools, using Vienna's case as a starting point for broader examination of institutional bias. UNESCO's involvement transformed a local incident into international scrutiny of American educational values and practices. Connor Blake's attempted plea bargain was rejected when prosecutors discovered the depth of his harassment campaign extended beyond Vienna to include systematic targeting of scholarship students, immigrants, and anyone who challenged his social hierarchy. Federal charges of civil rights violations carried serious consequences that his father's judicial position couldn't mitigate, and the trial became a national referendum on bullying, privilege, and accountability in American education. Vienna's testimony was devastating in its calm precision, describing weeks of systematic harassment while presenting audio recordings, social media evidence, and documentation of administrative indifference. Her diplomatic immunity meant she couldn't be cross-examined aggressively, giving her testimony unusual legal protection that frustrated Connor's defense team while providing prosecutors with unshakable evidence. The trial revealed that Connor's harassment campaign had been part of a broader pattern of discrimination at Roosevelt High, involving multiple students and faculty members who'd created an environment hostile to anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable American identity. The federal investigation uncovered systematic grade manipulation, discriminatory disciplinary practices, and administrative retaliation that painted a picture of institutional corruption beyond simple bullying. Marcus Rivera and Skylar Chen received plea agreements requiring community service, cultural sensitivity training, and formal apologies to every student they'd harassed over their high school careers. Their social media accounts, which had been used to amplify harassment campaigns, were monitored by federal probation officers as part of their sentences. The influencer career Skylar had been building through cruel content was permanently damaged by her association with federal civil rights violations. Westwood's affluent community was forced to confront the reality that their children's privilege had enabled criminal behavior that attracted international attention and federal oversight. Property values declined as the community's reputation for excellent schools was replaced by notoriety for civil rights violations and diplomatic incidents. Local businesses faced boycotts from international organizations, while the school district struggled with federal oversight requirements that complicated basic operations. The Colorado Department of Education implemented statewide reforms based on Vienna's case, requiring cultural sensitivity training and systematic monitoring of international student experiences. Federal education officials used Roosevelt High as an example of institutional failure, leading to national policy changes that strengthened protections for vulnerable students nationwide. Vienna's ordeal had become a catalyst for educational reform that extended far beyond her individual experience. Universities across the country began reviewing their international student protection protocols, recognizing that exchange programs involved diplomatic responsibilities beyond traditional student services. The Vienna standards became benchmarks for institutional preparedness, measuring schools' ability to protect international students and respond appropriately to harassment incidents. Vienna's story inspired international students worldwide to document harassment and demand protection, with her strategic approach becoming a model for students facing similar challenges in foreign educational environments. The viral nature of Skylar's original live stream had been transformed from humiliation content into educational material, used in diplomatic training programs and civil rights workshops to illustrate the importance of understanding international protections. Her case studies were incorporated into law enforcement training programs, teaching officers to recognize signs of systematic harassment and understand the diplomatic implications of incidents involving international students. The equipment room confrontation became a textbook example of de-escalation techniques and proportionate response under pressure, analyzed in military and security training programs worldwide. 1 year after the equipment room incident, Roosevelt High had been recognized by the Colorado Department of Education as a model for cultural inclusion and international student support. The transformation was so complete that the school was selected to host the state's annual International Education Conference, bringing together educators from across the country to study the reforms implemented following Vienna's case. Vienna addressed that conference as the keynote speaker, standing in the same gymnasium where Connor Blake had once held court as wrestling captain. Her speech focused on the importance of understanding cultural differences as strengths rather than threats, and the responsibility of educational institutions to protect all students, regardless of their backgrounds. Change isn't always comfortable, she told the audience of educators and students, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd demonstrated during her confrontation with Connor. But it's always possible when people choose courage over convenience and education over ignorance. The equipment room where I was assaulted has been converted into a cultural awareness center, but the real transformation happened in hearts and minds of people who decided that cruelty was no longer acceptable. Her presentation included video analysis of the original harassment incident, broken down frame by frame to show how systematic discrimination had been enabled by institutional indifference. The federal investigation's findings were presented as a case study in recognizing and preventing harassment before it escalated to criminal behavior, with Vienna's strategic response serving as an example of how preparation and knowledge could transform victimization into empowerment. The audience included many of the same faculty members who'd ignored her harassment, now required to attend sensitivity training as part of their continued employment. The transformation in their attitudes was visible, with several teachers publicly apologizing for their previous indifference and committing to active intervention in future incidents. As Vienna prepared to return to Austria for her final year of secondary education, she reflected on how much had changed since that September morning when she'd first walked into Roosevelt High as a nervous exchange student. The shy girl who'd hoped to quietly complete her year abroad had become an international symbol of resistance to institutional discrimination, inspiring policy changes that would protect future generations of international students. Her final day at Roosevelt High was marked by a celebration rather than the relief she'd once imagined feeling upon leaving. Students who'd once viewed her as a foreign outsider organized a farewell assembly featuring presentations about Austrian culture, international cooperation, and the value of diverse perspectives in educational environments. "You taught us that being different isn't something to be ashamed of," Sarah Henderson said during her presentation to the packed auditorium. "You showed us that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the person who seems different is exactly what a community needs to grow and improve." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just appreciation for Vienna's individual courage, but recognition of how her experience had transformed their entire understanding of community and belonging. The equipment room that had been the site of Connor's planned humiliation had been completely renovated into the Vienna Walsh Cultural Awareness Center, featuring interactive displays about international education, diplomatic protocols, and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. A plaque by the entrance read, "In recognition of the courage to stand up for justice and the wisdom to build bridges through understanding." Connor Blake was serving his sentence at a juvenile rehabilitation facility focused on addressing behavioral problems rooted in privilege and entitlement. His mandatory counseling sessions included video analysis of his harassment campaign, forcing him to confront the systematic cruelty he'd orchestrated. Letters he'd written to Vienna as part of his rehabilitation process showed genuine recognition of the harm he'd caused, though Vienna's response emphasized the importance of changed behavior over written apologies. Marcus Rivera had found unexpected purpose in peer counseling programs, using his experience as Connor's enforcer to help other students recognize and reject toxic group dynamics. His wrestling skills had been redirected toward coaching younger students, with emphasis on using physical strength to protect rather than intimidate vulnerable classmates. Skylar Chen's social media presence had been completely rebuilt around advocacy for international student rights and anti-bullying campaigns. Her transformation from harassment enabler to activist was genuine. Though her follower count never recovered from the association with federal civil rights violations, the live stream that was supposed to showcase Vienna's humiliation had become the foundation for educational content about the consequences of social media cruelty. The broader impact of Vienna's story extended far beyond Roosevelt High into national conversations about educational equity, international relations, and the responsibilities of institutions that host foreign students. Her strategic approach to documenting harassment while maintaining diplomatic protocols had become a model studied in international relations programs and civil rights advocacy organizations. Federal legislation inspired by her case strengthened protections for international students nationwide, requiring immediate federal notification of harassment incidents and establishing clear protocols for institutional response. The Vienna Walsh International Student Protection Act created oversight mechanisms that prevented schools from ignoring discrimination while providing resources for intervention and education. As her plane lifted off from Denver International Airport, carrying her back to Vienna and the next chapter of her life. Vienna looked down at the Colorado landscape that had tested her resolve and ultimately made her stronger. Somewhere below, Roosevelt High was continuing its transformation from a bastion of exclusion to a model of inclusion, proving that even the most entrenched prejudices could be overcome when good people chose to stand up for what was right. The exchange student who'd been targeted for being different had ultimately taught an entire community that diversity was a source of strength rather than division. In schools across America, students facing harassment and discrimination would remember Vienna Walsh's example and find courage to document injustice, demand protection, and never accept that cruelty was an inevitable part of education. Her story proved that sometimes the most powerful response to institutional failure wasn't fighting the system, but being so thoroughly prepared that the system had no choice but to change. The girl who was supposed to crawl had instead taught an entire nation to stand up for justice, one carefully documented incident at a time. Vienna Walsh had kept her promise to transform harassment into education, cruelty into compassion, and fear into the foundation for lasting change. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room really is the one everyone underestimates. And sometimes the best way to handle bullies is to be better prepared than they ever imagined possible. The equipment room confrontation lasted 23 seconds, but its impact would protect students for generations to come. The live stream that was meant to destroy Vienna had instead created a permanent record of institutional transformation, proving that individual courage combined with strategic preparation could overcome any amount of privilege, prejudice, and power. Her legacy wasn't just personal vindication, but systematic change that would ensure no other international student would face the harassment she'd endured alone. As stories of Vienna's courage spread through social media and international news outlets, young people worldwide found inspiration in her example of turning victimization into empowerment through preparation, documentation, and unwavering commitment to justice. The girl who'd learned to fight before she'd learned English had taught the world that education's most important lesson isn't found in textbooks, but in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when standing alone. Every time a student documents harassment instead of suffering in silence, every time an administrator chooses protection over reputation management, every time a community decides that inclusion matters more than tradition, Vienna Walsh's influence continues to ripple outward, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with one person refusing to crawl.